hijacking is seldom discussed in general aviation circles, but the possibility has existed since the beginning of passenger flight. We have with us Andy Downs, author of "Oh Captain, My Captain, What Do We Do Next?" Andy is a 20-year veteran of the aviation industry. He has owned and operated air charter and ground handling operations throughout the United States and 6 other countries. He is currently writing a book on the hijacking in which his father, Brent Downs, the pilot in command of a Part 135 flight, was shot and killed by a hijacker in 1971. Andy is also working on a documentary about the hijacking of his father, the passengers, and the crew. The movie is called 5/8 November. Andy's article goes to the heart of the question of standards of response and just who is in charge when a hijacked aircraft is on the ground. I'm pleased to have with us Mr. Andy Downs. Welcome, Andy.
Dave, it's a pleasure to be back with you. You're doing some great work.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. So, for those listening who may not know about the 5/8 November hijacking story, could you give us a brief summary of what happened?
Absolutely. My father was the first captain in the U.S. to be killed in a hijacking. And his last flight was October 4th, 1971, from Nashville to Jacksonville. And 2 men were kidnapping one of a soon-to-be ex-wife. And en route, my father radioed ahead to air traffic control and gave the demands. We need fuel when we land because the hijacker wanted to go on to Freeport, Bahamas, so that's why they were stopping at Jacksonville, charts, and to stay away from this aircraft. When they landed, the FBI surrounded the aircraft, refused fuel, and my father was able to get the co-pilot off by negotiating with the hijacker. Shortly after that, the second hijacker went off the airplane to check on his status. At that point, the FBI opened fire on the aircraft, which triggered the main hijacker into killing everybody on board, including himself. It turned out to be the first air piracy criminal trial in America, and it was actually the first time the FBI had ever lost a wrongful death suit. You got to remember that this was still J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. So it made a lot of history in a bad way. Some good things came out of it. The civil case my mother started actually forced the FBI to start the first hostage negotiation team. It was obviously a tragedy for us and hard to live with for a lot of years. And it's always been a source of concern as far as piloting command authority and making sure pilots actually have command authority in any kind of an emergency situation.
Andy, that's interesting you bring that up, because one of the quotations you provide from an anonymous law enforcement officer is pretty chilling. You quote the officer as saying, "It's ludicrous to think a pilot has any command authority during a hijacking." What do you think of that statement, and also do you think this is the attitude of the majority of law enforcement officers?
I've spent the last year and a half, almost 2 years, traveling around the country speaking to law enforcement organizations about my father's hijacking and how it relates to hostage negotiators. I speak to a lot of those. And actually, that quote was from an FBI hostage negotiator. Their attitudes presently are a result of the rule changes that have taken place since 9/11. They don't view a captain any differently than they do a manager of a 7-Eleven that might be held hostage. They do not think that a pilot is any different in those situations, and anything they say should be held in suspicion. Instead of viewing the captain as a resource, a trained, calm, cool resource that can be used in the situation, really taught right now to ignore them and rely on their own judgments, which, you've got to admit that they don't have the full picture without input from the captain.
Andy, that's interesting you bring up about the input from the captain. Can you cite for us those regulations that are involved in the authority of the captain?
Yes. In the FARs, you've got 91.3, which really mimics the ICAO, the International Civil Aeronautics Organization regulations in Annex 2, Part 2.3.1, which, as it goes into it, the pilot in command of an aircraft shall, whether manipulating the controls or not, be responsible for the operation of the aircraft, except that the pilot in command may depart from these rules in circumstances that render such departure absolutely necessary in the interest of safety. Now, that pretty much says a pilot can break any rule, regulation, or law he wants if he deems it necessary for the safety of the craft, himself, and his passengers that he's charged with taking care of. And I actually had a law enforcement guy tell me that the FARs don't apply to law enforcement, which I reminded him that, it's part of the U.S. Code, and he said, well, it may be, but that still doesn't apply to us. And he was dead serious. There's a real information gap between law enforcement and aviation that needs to be closed. There are a lot of preconceived notions. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And part of what I'm trying to do in my lectures, as well as a documentary that I'm working on, are try to highlight these gaps and hopefully start a dialogue between the two groups that we can bring things a little closer together, because as it stands right now, the captains don't trust the law enforcement, and law enforcement does not trust the captains. And that's a dangerous situation for us all to be in the future.
I absolutely agree. So that leads me into my next question here for you. I've heard different opinions from fellow pilots as to when they become the pilot in command and that final authority for anything involving their aircraft, including boarding the aircraft. One person told me that the last aircraft passenger door is when he becomes the boss. Another told me that it's when the first engine is started. When is it that a properly licensed and authorized pilot takes command?
Well, that's one of the problems we've got right now as far as regulatory guidance. Pre-9/11, it was a lot more clear, because if you're doing a pre-flight on an aircraft, you haven't even gotten into the aircraft, but the FAA would tell you you're absolutely responsible for doing your walk-around. You're also responsible for doing your flight planning and making sure that your weight and balance and all that stuff is done. And that's before you get in the aircraft. One of the problems we have right now are the vagaries in some of the regulations. And that relates back to command control during a hijacking as well, because pre-9/11, a pilot had, a captain, I should say, had the legal right and authority to refuse any and all armed intervention from law enforcement if they were on the ground. Now, that specific wording has been deleted, and it leaves both law enforcement and aviation in a gray area that we need some regulatory guidance, and we don't have it. It's eventually going to lead to an issue that is going to be a high-profile tragedy. That's what I fear.
Well, Andy, thank you very much for those thoughts. Now, I've been to your 5/8 November website. You and your brother Brent are working on this movie. You've been working on it for some time now. Can you tell us about it and when it will be out?
Absolutely. 5/8 November is a documentary film about my father's hijacking and the legal battles and all the issues that relate to today's aviation security that really originated in my dad's case.
Where should our listeners go if they want to make a contribution to the 5/8 November project?
They can go to our website, and it's a tax-deductible donation, 58november.com. That's 5/8 November, of course, is the tail number of my father's aircraft, so we named the film after that. But if you go there, you'll be able to see some of the work we've already done. You'll see the trailer, some of the history, and there's a page to donate. Any help anybody can put forth on any level is greatly needed. We need everybody's help. We really love to have aviation be a part of this aviation history in this project.
Well, Andy, I wish you the best of success with that. We'll put a link on our website to yours so people can click to and contribute. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be here with all of us.
Dave, thanks for having me back. I mean, it's an honor to be on your show, and we're deeply grateful.